discuss archaeology and geophysics, certainly, but first I want to tell you a little story. And this is a little story that I bet you know. It's a story that starts, well, quite a ways before this man appeared in Texas. But he, of course, represents one of the great Texans of all time, right up there with Nolan Ryan and I can't think of anybody else. Oh, Willie Nelson. In any case, the story concerns the Alamo. And of course, we know that much went on prior to the defense of the Alamo. It was ill-conceived, and Sam Houston himself opposed the idea. Nonetheless, the Alamo was defended and besieged. And it was besieged by a large military force from Mexico under the dictator, then dictator, Santa Anna. The line was drawn in the sand. Some dispute that, but how could they? Of course, the line was drawn in the sand. And those who stepped over it, all but one, were killed when the Alamo fell. And the destruction of that remarkable building set off the runaway scrape. And you all know this. You heard this, I hope, in school, although I'm not sure they all teach it anymore. But the runaway scrape was an attempt by the settlers in what was really east and central Texas to evacuate their property in advance of the Mexican army's thrust into central Texas. Well, as we know, anybody been to officers training knows you don't divide your forces in the face of an enemy of unknown strength and disposition, but Santa Anna, who's counting. So, of course, he did exactly that, and his army, his branch of the army, and Sam Houston ultimately met at that marvelous place that we call today San Jacinto, down near Galveston Bay, really in a place that kind of lacks the grandeur and prettiness that one would hope for a place like San Jacinto, but nonetheless certainly preserved. The battle that was met between Sam Houston and the Mexican army was a brief affair indeed, and as we know, the Mexican army was thoroughly routed. We tend to forget that a large segment of Sam Houston's force were Mexicans, and of course all Texans were Mexican at that time as well, most of them. And the destruction of the force at San Jacinto occurred just pretty much as it's represented here. With Sam Houston's army, it says his artillery had 2 pieces at most. He had a variety, some regular troops. He had a large component of cavalry of largely Mexican origin, ethnicity, and the Mexicans had set up very rudimentary breastworks, defensive positions, and they did have cannon, but they were in some fashion or another thoroughly unprepared. And when the Texans rushed them, and it really must have been nothing more than a rush, the vigor of that attack carried the breastworks immediately. And as a consequence, we all know this from our schooling, we all know that the battle lasted some 15 minutes, and then it was followed by a disgraceful slaughter of much of the fleeing Mexican army. Disgraceful slaughter indeed. It ends up, many of them were driven into one of the numerous sloughs there and were given no quarter. Santa Anna, as we all know, slipped away, changed into a private's uniform, and hoping to avoid capture, but was captured in fact, and his officers and men identified him by their deference, which was probably not what he meant with his disguise. He might ought to have put on a lady's garment or something. He might have gotten away with it, but in any event, here he is surrendering to Sam Houston in this famous photograph with Deaf Smith straining every, I'm sympathetic with this guy. Deaf Smith straining his every fiber to pick it up. And I know how he feels, believe me. If you've ever had to teach 250 undergraduate students in these huge classrooms at A&M, and then some guy in the back asks you a question. The little scoundrel couldn't think to sit in the front row and do it. But in any event, San Jacinto, of course, as we know, resulted in the birth of the Republic of Texas. Perhaps an ill-founded enterprise. Most of the rebels on the Texas side were hoping for unification with the United States. Instead, they got a republic that very shortly ran itself into terrible debt. But as they say, who's counting? And the money went fast. And Tejas became Texas. Well, soon after the battle, as we know, the battle space, almost immediately after the battle space became sacred space and part of the Texas mythos. This didn't stop scavengers from collecting battlefield souvenirs and equipment, for that matter, but that were left on the surface. However, that process, again, regrettably, continues almost to the present day. People are still scouring that battlefield, mainly for metal that metal detectors will reveal. I think that's pretty well been exhausted now, but nonetheless, the park has a hard time keeping people from doing that, and that's a pity, because of course what I'm going to visit with you now is the way that we have used, we're the official guys, we're using metal detection officially. These guys are just scavengers, so you have to figure out the difference. In any case, the fact that it has been so fully scoured over the generations since the battle does complicate what we have in mind, what we had in mind. In any event, the battlefield was commemorated in 1907. It's quite a while ago, and it was the first state park in the Texas State Park system, and it is, of course, a National Historic Landmark, marked by this remarkable obelisk, the top of which has a first-class museum that I urge you, if you haven't been there, I expect most of you have, but if you haven't, you ought to go there, because the museum is filled with some amazing artifacts, and it is marvelously interpreted, I must say. The state has done a wonderful job with San Jacinto. They are planning a variety of other alterations to the landscape that may or may not meet the same popularity with the public. They are very seriously fixing to get rid of this reflecting pool and restore the battlefield, ecologically anyway, to something approximating what it was at the time of the Battle of San Jacinto. As you might imagine, as you no doubt all know, the landscape around San Jacinto Park has changed considerably since the Republic. And it has gone from essentially really a wasteland at the edge of civilized settlement in Texas to something much more located in the industrial element that has become Texas. It is essentially an industrialized area. The Houston Ship Channel is down there, which, for better or worse, has been a major artery for commerce in Houston. It hasn't helped San Jacinto greatly. And much of the other surrounding elements in the environment are also complicating, I guess if you would, our understanding of the site and perhaps also our appreciation for the site. Can't push back the hands of time on that matter, but it is a complicating factor, the changes that have occurred there, essentially the industrialization of this portion of Texas. Now combine that with the fact that the entire environment there is low-lying ground, which is subject to seasonal flooding and thaw and drying. And that has an impact on the archaeology, which I'll mention in a minute. Also, of course, the spread of urban life, and it's a highly industrialized area, so there's a good deal of pollution that has entered into the ship channel and, of course, has complicated the maintenance of the park. There are, in other words, competing land use demands, and that's just the nature of the modern world. Combine that with the fact there that much of the soil there is a vertisol. I won't bother you with too much description of them, other than to suggest that this is a soil that's produced by seasonal wetting and drying. And from the standpoint of the archaeological record, it's very unstable. It tends to crack and open up cracks in drying seasons, and then material from one layer is often brought into lower layers in this vertisol, which complicates interpretation. Now, these and many other elements, I'm not singing you a sad song here, I hope, but I mean, these and other elements make it hard to answer questions about the battle, historical questions that demand answers to some extent. We have been given a narrative of the battle, and it's a very exciting narrative, and I think essentially an accurate one, but we would like to know a little more details about the position of the armies, the conditions of the armies, both of them, and ultimately the ultimate disposition of the material remains that those armies left behind. Now, it's often presumed, I think I have to blame the site of Pompeii for this, but it's often presumed that an archaeological site is just altogether there, and one kind of unfolds the soil, and there you have it. It's all the way it was left behind. Well, that's nonsense, even at Pompeii. But archaeologists often refer to that as the Pompeii premise. You start with the idea that the past is floating there, or rather, I guess, is imprisoned there like a insect in amber, and all you have to do is scrape off the detritus. Well, that's not the case. As a consequence of the many intervening factors here, and we, as archaeologists, brought geophysics in to help us sort through some of those intervening factors. Let me point out what some of the first ones would be. Now, as far as the battle goes, that's a catastrophic event, and it happens in a chaotic mass. Now, this one in particular, because the Texas Army was so utterly victorious. This means that the Mexican Army, when it began to fall apart, would immediately begin discarding their weapons. It seems counterintuitive, but this is something that happens on battlefields very often, that in the face of a defeat, the defeat can sometimes become a rout, and men will discard their weapons. So much of the Mexican army was essentially without weapons as they were retreating backward or being driven backward into the slough. That means down on the ground. We've got lead balls, we've got Brown Bess rifles. Brown Bess, it's a British rifle, a musket, I should say. I said rifle, and I misspoke. It's a musket. The British used it for 200 years. Don't want to waste money, and so leave this second-rate equipment in action for 200 years, and then when you're through with it, sell it to third world countries. Sounds certainly makes good economic sense, but they're stuck with these dogs. In any case, they were discarding them as fast as they could, along with other materials as well. What would the result of that be immediately is that the army coming behind, and this is something we don't like to imagine, but in these circumstances, armies invariably loot the dead. And they also scavenge on the battlefield. Guns are too valuable on the Texas frontier. You're not leaving those behind, even if they're dogs like the Brown Bess. You're not leaving them behind. You're not leaving lead bullets behind. You're not leaving bags of ammunition behind. You're picking that up, but you're also going through the pockets of the dead and getting their payrolls or getting whatever they have of value and taking their crucifixes, breaking them off. All the ugly elements that we can envision or associate with combat. My point is not to rag on the Texas Army. They're no different than any other army in that regard, but to suggest to you that that has an archaeological impact. If you're looking to unfold the past, just dig it up and have it pop out at you, you have to realize that it has gone through a remarkable sifting process initially. There is this collection and reuse that detracts, or rather extracts, from the archaeological site many of the key artifacts and elements that would otherwise tell us a great deal about what occurred there, but it's gone. Those things are gone. Now, the second thing that is, of course, operating here is what would, I think, best be classed, those would be cultural behaviors that create the archaeological record. The second element is what are called environmental factors. So organic material decays. Not to be too detailed here, but for the most part, it appears that the Mexican army was left unburied. And of course, many of them were in water. But they laid there unburied, and the flesh disappeared. And there were skulls on the surface of San Jacinto for a generation. We know that because James Audubon, collecting in Texas and drawing birds in Texas, collected a number of skulls from the site of San Jacinto. It's strange. I think they are now in the Smithsonian. But they were left on the surface, so they actually did become, at least in part of the archaeological record, but their surface exposure meant that they disappeared relatively quickly. Other elements were also affected by natural process, and one thinks immediately of the disintegration that occurs in metal tools. Not bronze, which is a very expensive and resistant metal, but certainly iron. And the disappearance of these tools further complicates, or rather diminishes, the archaeological record. What we're looking at here is the operation of entropy. So we'd like to know what the pattern of remains at San Jacinto was as a consequence, first of the battle, subtracting all of these formation processes such as looting or organic decay. And we turn to geophysics. And what we decided to do, and we've been working down there for quite a while. There's 2 PhDs have come out of this. I should hasten to add my collaborator in this is Mark Everett of geosciences and geophysics. And we have produced actually 3 PhDs, if you count one of Mark's, 2 archaeology PhDs. And we used what is called, we collected, I should say, what is called time domain electromagnetic induction. And we used a detector that I'll show you in just a second. Time domain electromagnetic induction. In other words, we use a device that sends a pulse of a particular quanta and then stops the charge and measures the return that we get from whatever object is in the ground. In other words, a kind of echo of that quanta onto our machine. Now, we perhaps won't go into much more detail and to say that we can derive from these pulses and the record that we get when they return a great deal of information about objects in the soil that happen to reflect this geomagnetic induction. And we can get an idea of depth, orientation, and so forth, primarily of metal targets, sometimes stone as well, but the metal targets are the ones that provide us with the best information. Buttons, metal buttons are there, certainly a great deal of military hardware that hasn't disintegrated entirely. We were able to recover cannonballs and the position of horseshoes and say, so what? So what? I mean, you can go down to a flea market and get that stuff. But What we want is not the stuff, believe it or not. Archaeologists are always saying, oh, we're only interested in information. And everybody knows we're a bunch of treasure hunting scavengers. But nonetheless, we do want to know where this stuff is relative to where other stuff is. And when we plot all the stuff that we get in this manner, which we could find in no other way except by geophysics, we have an idea of the configuration of that battle. Just a ghost of that original configuration, just a ghost, a shadow. But we can begin to get an idea of how that battle played out from the little tiny impulses that it left behind. Now, simply put, what these large initial quanta of data release is, well, what you end up getting is a quanta that decays quickly, and that is usually a shallow object. Slower responses show up later, and they are very often the deeper ones, and hence gun parts, cannonballs, and things of that nature can give us, we can get an idea of their depth as well. Well, one likes to imagine that geophysics employs hovercraft that sweep over the battlefield and it takes an hour and you're finished. But in fact, what we ended up, and when I got into this originally, that's what I was looking for. It was a hovercraft, and it turns out you have to drag the darn thing. Yeah, and when it's hot, well, we went from dragging the sled and acquiring data in that manner to this. This is space age geophysics, right? I know those guys hate it when I talk like this, but nonetheless, this is space age geophysics, the wheel odometer, odometer, there we are. And here you see the initial responses of a fast decay. They tend to be small, objects like button, while the slow decay down here tend to be larger objects. And the continual collection of data of that kind begins to provide us with a pattern. Now, we were sort of pushed aside in selecting where we would set up our collection data. I'm not giving the parks a hard time. They were wonderfully cooperative, but they have their agenda, and they also know that they don't want to be stumbling over archaeologists and geophysics all the time, and so they pushed us to one side of the battle, frankly, but it was fine, and they were otherwise very collaborative and cooperative with us. What you see are phase 1 and phase 2 grids, phase 1 being the one on the right and phase 2 the one on the left. They don't square up, and I know that's embarrassing, but these are two different PhD research projects, and if you think cats are hard to push, in any case, phase 1 survey grids takes forever to do this. Dragging the sled, I emphasize, and I was out there all the time. Why? I don't know. I thought I was supposed to just tell people to do this. But anyway, dragging the sled with these grad students, we did phase 1. And here you can get an idea from this pixel map of the contours of response that we were picking up. And as you can see, there's concentrations in various parts of the battle, and those are interesting. Some things were of modern origin, modern in the last 50 or 100 years, but some of them, in fact, the great number of them, because this was such an abandoned area for so long, the great number of them date to about the 1830s and 40s. Well, I hope these pixel maps make sense. Concentrations and absence. And here is a particularly significant one because, as you can see, there are no concentrations over here. There are plenty there. And an examination of the nature of those objects it gives us some idea of the contours, the boundaries, if you will, of that battle. When the Mexican army swept through there, discarding their weapons and often being killed right on the spot, we have an idea of pretty much where the battle took place, at least at this edge of the area. Well, one of the things that's nice about geophysics is they are humble. The geophysicists, if you've ever dealt with a physicist, they're very humble. No, I'm lying to you. They're the most arrogant people. But when it comes, they don't possess supernatural, superhuman powers, although they think they do. And what they don't possess is the ability to see in the ground. They're using pulses of electromagnetic energy. That's not the same. And so what they need is what we call, or what they call, ground truth. Ground truth. That's digging in the ground, you know, something that they thought they could eliminate by using electromagnetism, but no. So archaeologists check their findings by excavating. It's wonderful. But we're happy. We're happy. We'll put up with all of it, provided that they tell us where to dig. This is a happy conjunction. Yeah. They know where it is, and they're telling us. And the deal is, we show if they're right or wrong. Now, they're not always right. Something that they admit freely, or not freely, but they do admit it. And we are able, over time, we were over time, 2 dissertations, for goodness sake, we were able to aid them in fixing, or rather in calibrating the nature of their data collection. And also we combined with some statistical analyses that enable us to use that data as can lift it a kind of metadata approach. The statistics turned out to be as interesting, the correlations that turned out to be just as interesting as the clustering of data in the field. And you can see the excavation units here: geophysics, excavation, geophysics, excavation, and here we also were coring, soil coring, and so on. Well, this is not a magisterial find. This is not the great treasure at Ur. I admit that freely. But it happens, it's a very nice horseshoe, and it probably dates to the period. It wasn't any Texans' horseshoe, I don't think. They were so poor they couldn't rub nickels together, but the Mexican army was well stocked and well equipped, and very likely this is a horseshoe that dates to the period. It might have been thrown during the battle, we can't tell. Other nails and other objects that were repurposed, good archaeological expression. You make a hook out of a nail and things of that nature. And we found quantities and quantities of this material, much of it in a sorry state of decay, very difficult to determine its nature. However, the patterning and the clustering that these objects took on, that's a different story. That is a different story indeed. So here's what we've learned from the geophysical reconnaissance. Other things too. The precise location of subsurface metals, objects, metal objects chiefly. We did. We really have a marvelous picture. It is so labor intensive, however, the idea that we could ever do this for the entirety of the site, I don't have that many lifetimes ahead of me. But of course there's no shortage of graduate students, who knows? But I mean, there's a lot that remains to be done. I mean, they're not an endangered species, but there's a lot of work involved. Once we get that data, though, we have been using some fairly sophisticated statistical analysis and to determine what some of these clusters of metal objects, how they relate, if you like, to the battle, the cultural events that laid them down, and the subsequent formation processes such as decay and rusting and so forth. And the ultimate result was that we were able to formulate a new set of hypotheses as to the location of the battle. Now, we're not going to say it actually occurred close to Brooklyn. It's not that big a change. However, we have altered the perception of the battle boundaries in some ways and are prepared to test these hypotheses by moving to new locations. And those new locations will have to be tested archaeologically. In other words, we will have to go on to ground truth in the future. So, I'm emeritus. I'm out of here. But when it comes down to it, as I say, there are plenty of graduate students. They are not spotted owls. And so somebody will take this on. I know they will. And meanwhile, I want to thank you for your indulgence and kind attention. I appreciate it.